I'm Bridgid Nzekwu, the moderator. I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Loginov, Global CISO at Control Risks and Kraus Maffei, Brian Brackenborough, CISO at Channel 4, Mark Phillips, CIO at Countrywide, Thom Langford, founder of TL2 Security, and Duncan Brown, Cybersecurity Strategist, EMEA at Forcepoint. So gentlemen, welcome. And our first question today concerns recent data breaches. There have been many. We've seen just in the last few days the messaging firm True Dialogue. There have been recent breaches at TalkTalk, the Telco 3, BA, Marriott Hotels, and Facebook have all had fines because of data breaches. Many new regulations have come into force. In your opinion, do you think that at board level, the profile of cybersecurity is high enough? Do you think board level understands the risks, the potential risks? Can I start with you, Mark?
Certainly. There have been a number of high-profile cases in the news, and I think because of that, board level people are becoming far more aware of the importance of cybersecurity and their data that they hold. I also think that it's not just at board level. I think everybody now in society is becoming more aware of the importance of their data, so the employees in the organisation and the customers, the individuals as well. We're seeing this with changes in regulation with GDPR as well. So there's far more understanding of data and the importance of it now in society, not just at board level.
Would you all agree? Because we're still seeing these data breaches take place and apparently surprise some high-level executives.
Yeah, I think it's still quite a fragmented landscape out there. You know, there are some organisations that have risen to the challenge and take it very seriously, but there's still an awful lot that haven't, and have still got a lot to do. So, you know, it's a mixed bag.
I think profile of cybersecurity and risks has gone up at board level. I think capability has probably not gone up, and there is this mismatch. Part of it, I think, is the fault of the cybersecurity industry. That cybersecurity gets very complicated, very technical, very quickly. And I think we are not, as an industry, very good at communicating the risk that organisations face in terms that business understands and can act upon. So business likes to think about things or risks in business terms. You know, does my factory stop working? Can I not service my customers? And the industry is very good at saying, oh, there's a CVE vulnerability and you know, this kind of architecture. It's like that doesn't mean anything to a board level member. So
there's a job of demystifying
we
this.
need to get much better at communicating the risk in terms that business understands.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think businesses also have short-term memory, so they will be subject to some pain. The factory is shut down or whatever for a while.
Well, we've seen Telco 3 have a second disaster.
There are certainly some serial offenders for sure that clearly are not learning the lessons, but also, you know, if a competitor or a close industry related company gets breached, there is a bit of, could that happen to us? But you're right, Mike, I think very quickly afterwards, like back to business as usual, we don't really learn from those mistakes.
Yeah, and I think that's an indication that, if you've been hacked once, don't think it's not going to happen again. Because once you're on the radar, then typically the bad guys are going to be knocking on the door again. So you should be even more vigilant than...
But they're not, Thom, would you say?
But I think, I agree with Mike, it's very fragmented, but it's also very complex as well. I mean, let's take, for example, a board that does get it. That's just one of 100 other risks they have to take into account. So just because they don't throw millions of euros, pounds, dollars, whatever, at cybersecurity, doesn't mean they don't get it. It's just that it's in balance with a whole bunch of other risks they're trying to deal with. I think the other part, just to pick up on your point, Duncan, about serial offenders. These are serial offenders who are the subject of criminal acts, and I think we should, shift the focus a little bit away from, you guys are terrible, you don't do your jobs properly, to actually you are the subject of a criminal act. What else should be done in the greater industry to address this? Of course, there is some levels of incompetence and potentially gross incompetence in some instances. But in the majority of cases, people are doing the best they can with the resources they have, which are being spread very thinly, not because of greedy boards, just because of revenues, etc. And criminals are taking advantage of this.
It's a very good point, actually, because there's another debate going on today in Watford, in a hotel, a much less prestigious group of people, NATO, are discussing cybersecurity. So it is something that goes well beyond individual organisations.
Yes.
What do boards need to do then in terms of moving it up their list of priorities?
Well, again, I think one of the things that the NATO aspects are highlighting, this is not just about data and data security.
Yeah.
It's our whole infrastructure that's under attack. So critical national infrastructure, and those elements are key as well. Losing a bit of data is bad, but if our critical infrastructures are attacked, whether that's energy, utilities, banking, financial services, government, security services, whatever it might be, that could be much more devastating.
How vulnerable do you think our national critical infrastructure is? Obviously, that would come up at a COBRA meeting, and we should obviously be at one of those, shouldn't we? We should be saying this to government.
Absolutely. I think we should work from the perspective, whether it is or it isn't, that it's very vulnerable. That's a diplomatic response to that.
I think also that the threats that our critical national infrastructure face are the same as commercial enterprises. And yet commercial enterprises may not have the same capabilities and resources as Thom was saying. So, it's not as if critical national infrastructure is targeted by different organizations or different nature of attacks. These things filter, they may be created by hostile nations, for example, or facilitated by hostile nations, but they very quickly filter down to just any company. And so you've got a situation where a small company can be exposed to the same kinds of threats that a nation state is, but without the resources. So,
but the nation state doesn't always have the resources either. We're in the middle of a general election campaign.
I think that's
There's lots of questions
that's
about.
a two-edged sword. In fact, they might not have enough resources, therefore they're still relying on the kit that they installed in the 60s and 70s, which is maintained by two guys out of Watford with long beards and pens in their top pockets.
You've got nothing
in their 60s and 70s, but security through obscurity, but to a certain extent, because most corporations are operating on very modern, highly complex, highly potentially unstable because of the amount of vulnerabilities and patching that goes on, versus systems that are 30, 40 years old that actually nobody knows how to use. In often cases, don't even connect.
Can't be upgraded. Actually.
Well, can't be upgraded, but can't even connect to the internet in the first place. So. That's not to say that it's not an issue at all, but I think the threat model is very different for a critical infrastructure environment to a modern corporation.
Isn't it also, on the other hand, some protection if it's not connected to the internet? We're moving towards a connected world with 5G.
There is some
Internet of everything,
connection, but it's not guaranteed by any stretch.
But we've still seen evidence of air gap systems being
Yes.
hacked, such as nuclear industry.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's safe.
The old USB stick in the parking lot.
Yeah, but I think with the advent of IoT, the Internet of Things, everything is becoming interconnected on one level or another. Even these older systems, we're putting in place intermediate systems that sit between the old stuff and the new stuff to get that connectivity. So there isn't much these days that isn't connected for maintenance purposes or for whatever other reasons.
So the risk can migrate from something totally in a different sector or different field, a risk that, say, an organisation hadn't considered.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the prevailing trends right now is digital transformation. And that really means a bunch of things, but essentially it means the connecting of a whole range of different devices and systems, many of which are 30, 40 years old, never designed to be connected to the internet. And yet we do that. Why did we do that? It seems a crazy idea. We do it because of business reasons. We need to get the information in our operational technology systems, for example, into our IT systems so we can make sense of it, we can apply analytics to it and so on. So that's a business driver, and business always gets its way. What doesn't happen so much is, what's the security implication of doing that, and can we take just sensible, straightforward precautions? Quite often that doesn't happen.
So you would say that digital transformation would be being held back by cybersecurity?
Quite the reverse. I think that digital transformation charges ahead, and cybersecurity is
struggles to keep up.
It's left playing catch up. Absolutely, right.
There's that lovely story of the casino in Vegas that got hacked and lost money because their fish tank was insecure. So
I didn't see that scene in Oceans.
It's there somewhere if you look hard enough.
Yeah, but the drama's not there. There's no running around,
There's no George Clooney.
Exactly. Well, unless he's he's the little fisherman in the bottom of the tank.
But it's a good point though. If your fish tank isn't secure,
and it's
the
connected
whole
to the
house
rest of your
fall.
network. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's, smart buildings, smart cities, as we move into the future, all of that interconnectivity is there. So everything is connected. And that's before I even get into areas such as nanotechnologies. Which,
actually, let's come on to that in a moment. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the employee part of the puzzle. If you've got human beings involved, you can't have a totally infallible, perfectly secure system. Can you?
Well, not today.
Or would you say it's possible?
If you're an Elon Musk and you look into the future, I mean, Elon Musk's vision is that we'll all be replaced by machines at some point.
I thought this was a bit of a dystopian future.
Well, yeah, exactly. But then I guess you could argue, well, what's the impact on society and how much do we care and how far in the future is that? I guess.
And then are you not just agreeing that in order to make your network and everything secure, you have to remove the human element?
Well, I think that's what he's saying. If we all become...
But that's like saying we'd be able to get our job done if it wasn't for these damn customers.
Isn't part of making an organisation secure is more than just patching or addressing vulnerabilities. It's also around education and awareness.
I think in an ideal world that would be true. All of the evidence points to education not working. I mean, it works a bit, but most often what happens is it's like sheep dip. You get dumped in the tank, and then after a few days, weeks, if you're lucky, months, it's forgotten. We need a more humane set of guardrails that pop up, I think, that say, ooh, what you're about to do has an element of risk in it. Do you want to proceed, or and a business can take a view on whether they just block that, which is
bring back Microsoft Clippy.
Do you really want to write a letter?
Yes.
Those guardrails then creates the dynamic between digital transformation, the ability for an organisation to be agile and move forward, and then constraining that by the cybersecurity. That becomes the balance.
So you need to do it very carefully, for sure.
Yeah.
Mark, your organisation is involved in turning businesses around. Is this something that comes up during that process?
Absolutely. So in the turnaround space, I'm quite often working with organisations that are in a somewhat more distressed state or operating environment where there's quite a long tail of legacy IT infrastructure. So they actually see the opposite, where digital transformation actually can improve security because it has been perhaps neglected for such a long period of time, that when you move into that new world of transformation, you're then starting to understand those risks sometimes for the first time, or at least getting them surfaced to the right level, and then you are then beginning to address them. So it's not always, digital transformation isn't always seen as something that's fighting against security. It can actually be a catalyst for improving organisations.
Do you think the more digital savvy generations who might have a few grey hairs than us are in a better position to deal with cybersecurity in the future because they've grown up in a digital space? Do you think that will improve the security of organisations?
It's an interesting dilemma in terms of if it's a question of privacy of data. I think the younger generations are much more open with their data. Whether that's a good thing or not remains to be seen. Personally, my view is it's not a good thing. I think maintaining the security and privacy of our data is something that's been hard fought.
Is there a backlash over it, do you think? The Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, highlighting.
Well, I think only if those generations perceive that to be a problem and an issue. And at the moment, I think they're quite open with their data, more open than perhaps some of the older generations have been. So there is a sea change going on there.
Yeah. But, they certainly feel more qualified to make security decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are.
Duncan?
I think we underestimate the sophistication with which young people are approaching data. They curate it very carefully. So, I think it's people of, dare I say, our generation that just put all of our information on Facebook without really thinking about it. But the younger generation, they use first of all, they use a variety of social media for very specific purposes, and use particular technologies in particular groupings to talk about specific things. So they curate their data much more carefully than we think than we would do in our generation.
But you think there's some naivety on their part?
There's naivety, evenly spread throughout society. I think even amongst people that ought to know better. And again, you get back to this fallibility of the human, which I think modern approaches to cybersecurity are trying to not eradicate, but at least minimise. But I think we need to bite the bullet, frankly, in the industry and do a little bit more checking and monitoring of what people are doing. Are they about to expose themselves or their organisation to risk, and to step in at that point, saying you really ought not to do that.
But for them to understand why they shouldn't do that there is an important role for education to play.
Yep.
But you did make an interesting comment earlier, which I'm interested in fellow panellists' views, which was you think the education piece doesn't always work or doesn't stick.
Absolutely.
What can we do about that?
Absolutely. I mean, putting people in a room and shouting PowerPoints at them for an hour, proven doesn't work.
I think that's happening today in Watford, isn't it?
I think so. Or someone's shouting bigly. But the thing with education is that it's got to be done in a way that creates a visceral response in people. So, for instance,
shock and awe.
No, absolutely not. But I think if I was talking to an ex-policewoman the other day, and she was talking about some riot control training that she did. None of it was classroom-based. It was, or very little of it. Most of it was basically being in the kit and having a shield and a baton and having bricks and firebombs thrown at her, and learning how to deal with it and become accustomed to it. That's because that's creating an actual physiological change in her body and her brain around what she can do and how she can respond and what she should be doing, etc. Now, not suggesting we do that per se, but what we do need to do is create visceral responses in people. We need to evoke memories, we need to evoke, humour, laughter, etc. Shock and awe works once, and then the effectiveness of it decreases over time. So, it's
How can we? Do you agree? We need this kind of visceral response.
Yeah,
How can we produce
Well,
that?
I think what you're trying to do is to program or reprogram people to do the right thing and less of the bad thing. I mean, rather than the visceral response, I think I would prefer the term muscle memory. But I don't know what you're getting at, Thom. But for example, younger drivers are encouraged to have these black boxes in their cars when they're driving, and
So they save some money on their insurance.
For sure, the motivation for them is saving money, but the outcome is that they actually learn better driving practices. Not to drive so fast, not to corner so fast, not to brake so suddenly, which is actually educating them and reinforcing these good behaviours, which we hope will persist beyond them having insurance. So that's the kind of thing that we need to introduce in cybersecurity. We need to introduce this kind of black box system that is looking and encouraging positive behaviours.
But when you see those advertised by insurance companies, what they're doing is they tell a story. They tell a story about Jake, 23, gets in his car, etc., etc. That's what we need to be doing with our awareness, etc. Is telling stories. Stories are as old as we are, as old as humanity. Stories are what actually connect people together. What we don't do is talk about, people in their daily lives and how they can respond, etc. We just say, don't do this, do this, never do that.
It's part of the problem that the stories don't talk enough about the dark side. The best stories, fairy tales, are quite upfront about the dark side. The dark side might be your banking details will never be secure.
Well,
do banks say that?
Well, you only ever pay attention to anything if you're interested in it. It's like school. You're going to do far better in a class where you're interested in the topic, or you can relate to the topic, than something that you don't. So if the story is something that's relatable to you, this could happen to me, as opposed to this could happen to my company's data. My credit card details could be stolen. I could lose money. My house could get broken into. You pay attention. And by educating the individual about security within their own lives, then you hope and pray, and most of the time it happens, they then bring that back into the organisation itself. So they start to understand, I'm password protecting my files when I'm sending them at home, or I'm storing them on my storage at home, password protected. I should be doing that as well at work, surely. And so it starts to build up, and it just becomes part, as you say, muscle memory, or just part of their everyday lives that they're thinking twice about what they're doing. A lot of the time we talk about company data. But of course, one of the main things that we've got within the HR department is data about the individual and their next of kin and their financial details and everything else. So if you start talking about that, then they start to twig. When we introduced single sign-on, suddenly a number of people realised that if they shared their passwords with people when they went on holiday, it meant that they could log in and see their pension details. And so they started to think twice. They weren't thinking about the company data, they were thinking about their own data. But we still get the same end result. So, we're happy, they're happy.
So that comes back to incentivisation as well. It's the same bit with the insurance, the black box in your car, you get cheaper insurance as a result of that. So if you can align and incentivise people to adopt these practices by making the work easier through single sign-on, the data being in one place, then that's also another reason why people are more likely to adopt and listen.
And you can change the culture of an organisation by creating cyber champions that are demonstrating and spreading good practice, and you're getting a sense of protecting oneself, but also helping to protect the company.
Have you seen the idea of a cyber champion working in a British context? I can imagine a few raised eyebrows. Employee of the week. It's a bit.
Well, we have.
People really want to follow a cyber champion.
Well, we have data protection champions where I work, and that seems to work very well. They don't necessarily want to come down to the CISO or to the information security department to talk about certain things or confess their sins. But if they're talking to somebody within their own department, somebody that they work with every day, that they can get that advice from, and then that can filter down. That seems to work a lot better.
Yeah, I think the notion of setting up cybersecurity champions around an organisation is a really good one, because as a CISO, I generally don't have enough resources. So if I can muster up a team of virtual cybersecurity champions who are much closer to the day-to-day business than I am, then it's usually a really good thing. But I just pick up on one thing, interesting point that somebody mentioned to me the other day around this muscle memory thing that we're talking about. And technology is actually changing the way that we are hardwired to interact with it. For example, if I just use an example, most of us here, if we're getting in a lift, which finger would you use to press the button?
Index.
Yeah, you do that.
Straight away.
Whereas kids these days, I watched my kids the other day getting in the lift and they're using their thumbs. So they're hardwired to be doing this stuff. So things are changing. It's changing.
Their thumbs are longer as well for the phone. It's an evolutionary thing.
Fitter and faster.
Yeah. More muscle.
So we've agreed that there are boards who take it seriously. We've agreed that not all organisations fully understand the risk. One of the questions that they might be asking themselves at board level is, how much security do we really need? What's the answer to that? How does a business decide how much security is enough security so they don't become the next three?
It depends on what point you ask that question as well. If it's before a breach, perhaps not quite as much.
Yes.
If it's after a breach, it's a lot.
Let's do both. Before a breach, how does an organisation decide what should be in place?
It's all about risk assessment and understanding what the risk is, how real is it, what's the impact of it, and is mitigating it cost effective, or is it going to constrain the business operation? And as I said earlier, often organisations at the board member level don't have all of that information to make the right risk decision. So they say, it's not going to happen to us, or the impact is not going to be that great. And then you get the bang, and then there's a reassessment of, I wish we'd known about that. So it's making an informed risk assessment. That's the core of it.
And the informed part is key. So that's our job here, because it is
absolutely.
It is sort of deeply entrenched in technical language that they're not going to understand.
Yeah.
For all those reasons, it's our job to properly quantify that risk and then gauge their appetite. Because if they have a different opinion pre or post a breach, it just means they didn't properly understand that risk in the first place. So
it comes down to the ROI of the board. The the risk of incarceration.
I like that.
How much do we have to spend to make sure that we stay out of trouble? And I think that very much depends on the industry. If you're an industry, I would imagine any vendor in the security space would probably invest more into security than
Do you do?
Yeah, well, I'd like to think so. Than say, a clothes retailer, for instance. But I think it's that risk model, that threat model, is very different according to where you sit in your market.
But I think the other thing that impacts on that as well is the Chief Information Security Officer as the custodian, the communicator, and the guy that's perhaps
not all organisations have that role, though.
No, that's true. But for those that do, it's an important role in determining the culture of the organisation. There's not just one type of CISO. Different organisations, different CISOs. There are those that are very technical and focus on that. There are those that are more operational. There are those that are strategic, and some are advisory. So, it's not one size CISO fits all. But the role is incredibly important.
There should be one in every organisation.
So, and there's the rise of the virtual CISO. So where smaller organisations can't afford a full-time CISO on their own, they can just buy a part-time CISO and use that. So.
But I think you're absolutely right that there's as many CISOs as there are roles. The challenge is where that CISO sits, what their reporting lines are, and what their remit is. So very often, it's still the case, and as it was 10 years ago, they sit 2, 3, 4 levels below the board. They report into the chief risk officer, who reports into the CIO, who reports into the COOs. And at that point, any message the CISO gives is diluted to beyond recognition.
So this is part of the first thing we discussed, actually, which is, are boards fully informed, and are their ears open? Do they want to hear it?
So yes to the second part, and I think no to the first part. I think it's all to do with it. If we've got CISOs that are very technical, their message needs to be diluted is one word for it, or
demystified,
translated into business language. And so I think one of the interesting to read your book, Mike. I'll get on it for Christmas for sure. But there is this. I think. Thank you very much. You can sign up for me later. I think there is this transition going on in terms of the role. So I've seen good technical CISOs upskilling to business acumen for sure, but I have also seen organizations getting fed up with technical CISOs that are too technical, essentially being displaced by business people with very little security capability, but they have the language and they have the ear of the board, and the technical nuances are, someone else can deal with that. If individual CISOs don't skill up and don't make themselves relevant to the board,
some of the softer skills,
they will end up being irrelevant and being displaced.
I used to joke when I first became a CISO that all I do now is PowerPoint and politics, and then 4 years after, just as I was finishing my CISO gig, it was like all I do now is PowerPoint and politics, because there is a need for that gap to be filled between those that are technical and actually can deal with the operational, and actually talking to the board and leadership and trying to make them understand what the principles are. And personally, there is some argument of this in the industry. Personally, I think a CISO should not be technical per se. There should be a background. There should be, I could set you up a Novell NetWare environment running IPX, SPX, no problems at all. But I don't even barely understand what software is.
At an executive level, how technical are they generally?
They're not. The CFO's not the best accountant by any stretch of it.
It doesn't need to be.
No, exactly.
The chief executive doesn't,
it's
not
not
to be a technical person per se.
No.
Some companies they are, but most they're not. So, my argument really is that the CISO should sit alongside the chief financial officer at that level, because the CFO is responsible for bringing the cash into the organisation. To me, the CISO is about protecting it when it's there. And the company's not losing it.
But I think the key there is alongside the CFO.
Alongside CFO.
So reporting into
the
CIO or
Yes, absolutely.
which is starting to see examples of.
So one of the concerns I have in many organisations is that they don't have a security strategy, or it's not built into the business strategy. So they may have a business strategy. Even if they do have a security strategy, it's completely misaligned to business. So you've got a disconnect again between what security organisations try to do and what the business wants it to do. And that, digital transformation is the crux of that. Connecting our operational technology systems or Internet of Things or whatever it is that we're doing, moving to the cloud. Businesses have to do it. And where's security in that discussion? It's quite often not in that discussion. So organisations need to have a security strategy, number one, and number two, it needs to be aligned to what the business wants.
Are there particular industries or sectors where you feel that mismatch is at its worst? Are there particular areas of the economy that are more vulnerable for those reasons?
It's an interesting question. I mean, there are characteristic types of organisations, industries that are generally more mature. Financial services, for obvious reasons, telecommunications and critical national infrastructure, again, for obvious reasons. So you can make those generalisations, and the counter argument is also true. So retail organisations, manufacturing organisations, public sector, particularly local government, tend to be less mature. But for every generalisation, there are always exceptions. Always exceptions. Yes. So you need to be quite careful about that.
It's less around the sector; it's more around the maturity of the organisation and the resources they have available. I think in terms of how secure is secure. A lot of it comes back to your earlier point at the start of the panel around. It depends on how many resources, how much revenue they've got to be able to invest.
That's usually the defining factor: is how much do you want to spend on it.
So they might have been personally affected, perhaps in a previous company or something like that, because they may bring a lot of security culture with them as a result.
You mentioned earlier the arrival of GDPR. Has that changed attitudes? Has it changed understanding, behaviour?
I think it's been the bane of a lot of organisations.
Everyone's groaning.
But one of the things it has done, in my opinion, is raised the awareness, and that's one of the things that you were able to actually start that dialogue at board level, because executive members and board members were reading in the papers about this horrendous thing that was coming into law, that was coming into effect, and they were going to be fined this much percentage of their revenue, and suddenly it became a reality for them. So that actually allowed that dialogue to begin.
It's a really interesting space, because when GDPR first came in, I work as an interim, much like Mark here and Thom, and I thought I'd go out and get qualified. So I went out and qualified as a certified GDPR practitioner and a certified data protection officer. I did all of that stuff, and the number of calls I've had for that service since I qualified, I can't
made your money back then.
I haven't got the courses back. Now, whether that's reflective or not, I don't know, but it would seem to be, because I get plenty of work from cybersecurity, but very little from GDPR as a.
But I think that was part of the problem was the hype. It was a bit like the Y2K bubble. I mean, there was always May 25th is the day. It's going to be, zombies will rise from the graves on May 26th, etc. All that sort of thing. Nothing really happened. There are some countries where it's being used more effectively than others. I think Germany, Spain, and France have got the highest number of actual actions as a result. Brought through the GDPR regulation. GDP regulation. But over here, it's been a bit of a damp squib. And part of that, I think, is the underfunding of the ICO. I think there's a hype, so when the BA breach happened, there was big hype, they're going to be fined so many millions of pounds. And actually, it was an intention to fine, and BA can then respond. So the massive hype around it, but with nothing actually happening, has meant that people are like, we'll just wait.
There are firms that are completely ignoring
some people,
when they do get fined. So,
absolutely.
It's an evolving kind of space.
Yeah. So it's brilliant now, so that you've got companies that will focus on any projects that have got PII involved. But there's an awful lot of projects that you do, a lot of technologies and things that you put in place that don't. So what you see is the focus is the data going to be protected? Is there PII? No. Okay, backseat. And then suddenly you don't hear about that project until the very end. So I would argue that, it's helped to increase the focus with regards to data, and that is obviously important, particularly if you're collecting data of the public. But what about your other projects that you're doing and the other technologies? What about actual cybersecurity as opposed to the data protection? And that's kind of what worries me. So now if there's a breach or if we're doing any of our cyber exercises, the first question is the viewer data okay? Is the public data okay? Yeah, it is. What about the other things? What about the firewalls and everything else? Are we patching those? Are you giving us the sufficient downtime so that we can keep those secure? We have a great, we've got GDPR, we had data protection that went through a number of reviews throughout my career, and yet we've still got the Computer Misuse Act, which is about as good as a stone tablet. It's, it means nothing these days. It's very, very difficult to implement or to back up. So you chat to people about, sharing of passwords and doing some of the bad habits that they've picked up once they've passed their driving test, but you've got nothing to fall back on to explain to them why they shouldn't be doing it. And you sit in a room with them during their inductions or during your presentations, if you can get into the departmental meetings and you're explaining it. And as far as they're concerned, that's just the CISO, that's just that guy, he just wants to do it because he's trying to build his empire. It doesn't matter because you've got no legislation to fall back on. You can't go, if you share your passwords and you are impersonating another user, you could go to jail. They just laugh you out of the room.
Do you think that then there's some work to be done in politics? Do we need some bills brought forward?
I had this conversation about 3 weeks ago with the government about this. They were talking about, they sort of come to us to chat about the election coming up and a few bits and bobs, and we sort of sidetracked and started talking about this. It's like, where's our support for this? Where's the support for the technologies and the security of the technologies that we're going to need in our industry? Because, within broadcast, we've gone from, look, there's your broadcast network, which is all coax, and here's your computer network. They've all converged. Where's the security or the regulation or the legislation that helps us to protect that?
Regulation isn't always the answer, though.
But it helps.
It helps, but it's a real backstop, I think. I think that if it's there when industry has not responded, when industry has carried out unethical or immoral activities, etc. But regulations backfire so frequently.
Regulation is generally an afterthought, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Reaction to
I think that's exactly
public backlash to whatever an event is.
But you're saying it's a necessary safety net, or it's a necessary...
I think we need to have something with which to build our foundations on. At the moment, it's just us.
I think one great area of example of this is in AI, artificial intelligence, and we can. If you listen to people like Elon Musk talk about AI, I mention him again. He's pretty fearful, and he knows quite a bit about the direction of travel. He owns an AI company and is doing some work there. So, his view on regulation is that certainly in that specific area, if we don't regulate, we could end up in a very difficult place.
Well, honestly, I
think the internet's a great example of that, isn't it?
Yeah. GDPR is in essence, an ethical framework for the treatment of personal data, and absolutely, I think we will see an AI, an artificial intelligence regulation that will be, from a principles point of view, very similar to GDPR. GDPR, in many ways, it's a missed opportunity, and if it's not enforced, then kind of what was the point? But
the point is, GDPR is an after the event. I mean, we've had all these issues. We've had all these.
We have, and as Thom said, the market hasn't
responded. Most people in the US have probably had their data breached at least once. So it's really after the event. And with AI, the argument is we can't afford to wait till afterwards, because afterwards it's too late.
What are the consequences? Why is it too late? What's the worst
have you not
that could
seen
happen?
Terminator?
What's the worst that could happen? Is Skynet about to take over?
Cyber systems.
I think that's part of the issue we don't really know. So there's a risk exposure there, and we're trying to mitigate the unknown as best we can.
This reminds me of the Donald Rumsfeld known.
Exactly.
Known.
Yeah,
So
is
this is a known
unknown,
or is it an unknown unknown?
It's a known unknown.
It's a known unknown.
I'll take your word for that.
It's quite hard. Is it quite hard to persuade boards to do something about it?
I think this
A known unknown.
it's a bit like climate change, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the issue is always should we versus could we. There's always this temptation to deploy technology for competitive advantage, or just because it looks like a really cool idea, without really understanding the implications for society. And that's why we need regulation, that we will charge ahead and deploy AI in a whole variety of contexts, benign and otherwise, without really understanding what impact this is going to have. So as Mike says, absolutely. For once, I think we need to get ahead on the regulation. And I think we've got a very good template for what that could look like, and it's going to look, I would think, something similar to GDPR. GDPR is actually quite a light piece of regulation. It's not specific. It basically puts the onus on companies to do the right thing and to evidence the fact that they're trying really hard to do the right thing. And that's kind of what it says. That's GDPR in a nutshell.
Same way as it's like climate change. It is like climate change in the sense that climate change doesn't respect geographical or political boundaries. So it's a similar situation with AI and
cyberspace,
the technology landscape. So that doesn't respect political boundaries a lot of the time as well. So how do you legislate when these organisations are global organisations operating out of anywhere?
It's the equivalent of having, I told you I was sick on your gravestone.
Spike Milligan's.
Spike Milligan, yeah.
It also puts me in mind of the financial crisis.
Yeah.
Because the financial crisis, the problems were global, but they started in a particular territory. Are we learning from those kinds of experiences when we're moving towards a connected world and driverless cars and kind of
Not really,
data
no.
in the cloud, all of these?
I think the right people are saying it, but the right people aren't listening to it. We joke about the Terminator, we joke about Star Trek, and things like that. But in actual fact, we've got that, and you can see it, and it's the art of the possible. Nobody wrote a film in the 70s about a data breach because it just wasn't going to be sexy. But we've had all of these things. So you talk about we don't know what could happen with artificial intelligence or through machine learning, but we could have a pretty good stab at it.
We need to make a start.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And so the whole Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web and everything at the time when they were saying there shouldn't be any rules, it should be open to everybody. And look at where we are now.
Yes.
And so, we should be saying with hindsight, we need to get this right this time, and we need to make sure that we have those regulations and those rules in place before we go any further. But as you said, there is this push at the moment. It's the next best thing. I want to have the competitive advantage. I need to have that competitive advantage. So we'll just plough ahead anyway. And it's quite worrying.
My question is, who is we? When you say we need to get ahead, who is we?
Someone else.
Yeah, exactly. That's the easy way out, isn't it? Yeah, someone should do something.
Yes.
Who is we? Is it politicians?
Ultimately,
is it NATO? Is it the CISO of every
United Nations?
All of the above, to be quite honest. I think the consequences
Are global.
and impact every single human being on the planet, and therefore we need to better understand it and get our arms around what some of those consequences could be. Some of them may be perceived, some of them may be real, some of them may not. But until we better understand and know and research that space, then there is a huge exposure there. And, there are some visionaries who are really focusing on this space that are saying we need to do it sooner rather than later. And these are not long-scale things. This is the next 10, 15 years.
Short-term thinking is also perhaps one of the failings, not thinking far enough ahead.
Which is
that's
be the case in business.
That's natural anyway. I mean, politicians come and go in sort of 3, 4, 5 year phases. Companies are measured on performance in some cases every quarter rather than over a 10-year period. It's all short term.
That's the commercial world, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And the political landscape as well. That's how things are.
Are there some examples of best practice you can enlighten us on? You obviously work in this space. Can you give us some examples of organisations who've got kind of an integrated platform approach, or they're going for an external best breed product that's transformed their approach to cybersecurity?
I think the first thing to do is, instead of just implementing technology for technology's sake, is first to understand the threat landscape. So, as a CISO, I'm ex-military, so I'll use some military terminology. I need to understand my battlefield. I need to understand where my assets are. And if I can't see where those assets are, it's very hard for me to defend them. So the first thing I do, working with an organisation, is really get a good grip and a good handle on what's where. Which are the key assets, and where can I spend the most money, or where do I need to spend all my resources really defending those bits that need defending most. So that's the first thing. But even organisations who spent zillions and billions in technology per se have still been hacked.
Yes.
So
Yes.
technology is not the answer by itself. It's much more, as Tom's alluded to, it's a much more convoluted and intrinsic landscape than just tech for tech's sake.
Yeah.
Technology is the answer and needs to be a part of the answer for sure, because it's created the problem,
Mhm.
but it also has to be part of the solution. As humans, as we've been speaking about, are very fallible. So we've got to put in place stuff that protects us.
I think the paradigm that we all use in our industry is attack and defence, this kind of thing, and the archetypal castle and moats and high walls and drawbridges and all that kind of stuff. The reality is that most organisations are living in not a castle but in a museum, and where outsiders can come and go as they please. Because we've connected all our systems to the internet, so I think the paradigm, the model that we have in mind is out of date. We need to think much more in terms of a museum model where people can come and go. Yeah, we know we have our crown jewels or a Mona Lisa or whatever that we need to protect behind glass and alarm systems, but a lot of the stuff that we have in our organisations can be viewed openly because that's what we want businesses to do. We want to collaborate with third parties and let our customers come in and interact. So changing the paradigm and the kind of the mental model that we have and communicating that in those relatively straightforward terms to board members will help to change the game, and then that drives back to the strategy question. That then drives the kinds of technologies that we need to deploy that allow that openness while maintaining security. That's a hard thing for the industry to shift around, but I think that's where we need to move towards.
Well, you've used two verbs that in some minds would cancel each other out, which is allow openness whilst maintaining control.
So that's the apparent contradiction, but it needn't be that way. But I think if we have the mental model of building high walls, then all the evidence points to the fact that those walls get breached at some point. So that's why we need to rethink.
You build a 30-foot wall, you'll sell 31-foot ladders.
Do you have overall a positive outlook for the future? Do you think these challenges are going to be tackled in the way you've described? You pointed out some of the challenges, you've pointed out some of the solutions, and the fact that it might be a global approach rather than in a particular territory. Do you feel hopeful, or are you pessimistic about the future? Do you think actually it's quite good to be pessimistic because we're staying in a job, because we've got work to do?
Just
because
pessimistic in general.
I think by nature security is because we are responsible for protecting our organisations, employees and data in organisations. Personally, I'm optimistic. I think that we've come a long way. I think we understand the threat landscape much more, although it's constantly evolving. I do think that we need to. I think we're always playing catch up, and I think we do need to try and get more proactive in our approach rather than reactive to what the threat landscape is doing. But there are signs that the industry is switching towards that. I think if we focus on the human element and trying to reduce the fallibility of humans, that will be a big step in the right direction.
I'm going to ask all of you that question actually. Mark, what's your view?
So I'm
in terms of
optimistic about the future. I can see that the awareness of security is changing across the board level, and I'm seeing the change in behaviours and cultures within organisations. I'm seeing the change in the structure of organisations where CISOs are being brought out separately from underneath the CIO, the CTO. So I'm seeing that not all organisations are going to be able to keep up with that. We spoke about the maturity of different organisations, and some won't get it and will fall by the wayside along as we progress. But overall, I think I'm positive and optimistic.
And when you say fall by the wayside, it could be business ending. It could be.
Well, even if it's not necessarily from a data breach or security, cybersecurity breach, just by failing to keep up with digital transformation, the latest technologies, the way cultures are changing. We spoke about the younger generation coming through. A lot of people just aren't seeing the direction of travel. Where those organisations don't, they will fall behind. play as a result.
Thom?
Yeah, I think so, because I think 10 years ago, one, we wouldn't even be sat in an environment like this talking about this kind of stuff in the first place. We'd have all just been, stuck behind our computers moaning about users and boards and stuff anyway. So I think there has been progress. I personally have seen progress, again, with the location of the CISO, the evolution of the CISO from, the IT person, what does security, through to actually somebody who does point of politics, for want of a better way of putting it. And I think in the future, and again with the level of interest there is from the media, from boards, from companies generally, and the types of services that they're availing themselves of, I think that it is becoming a more positive influence and a more and business enabler, for want of a better phrase, to any organisation. Whereas I think before it was always seen as an overhead. I think we're still in the early stages of that. Not every business has a security vision or a security strategy or barely a security culture, but these things are now being talked about. There's even products on the market that helps do this, and services, etc. So yeah, I think on the whole it's good. Is it fast enough? We'll see.
Maybe not. Brian, can I get your view?
I think it's very similar to Tom's. If I look at 10 years ago and the situation that we were in within the broadcast industry compared to now, it has moved quite fantastically. The boards are listening to their information security experts and taking their advice on board. So if that trend was to follow, then yeah, I would be hopeful. What worries me is digital transformation, as you said, is moving at such a rapid pace that cybersecurity is struggling to keep up. And I feel that companies feel under so much pressure to move into the digital landscape, to get rid of legacy systems and to push it all into the cloud, that sometimes they don't necessarily ignore the cybersecurity side of things, but they don't give it as much attention as they should do. And so I am worried. It's not unfixable, and I think we are going in the right direction, but I think we're a couple of miles behind the whole digital transformation thing, and that scares me.
But I think the onus should be on the security function to try and catch up, or to catch up and work out how to do that.
Yeah,
not necessarily for digital transformation.
But it's not just try; they should also be given the opportunity to
Yeah,
do so.
absolutely. But push.
Yeah.
And last but not least, Mike, your view of the future, positive or negative?
Optimistic in some areas. That's my diplomatic answer, not a political answer. Pessimistic in others. Prefer to spend more time in the optimistic space than the pessimistic space, because it's quite dark and there's a self-preservation piece to it all that is important when you're a CISO. It's very easy to focus on dark stuff. But I think overall, I'll probably describe myself much more as a pragmatist. So dealing with the situation that's there, responding accordingly with the resources that we have available to us. So yeah, overall I am positive, but on the basis that we take things seriously. We start to get our arms around some of the challenges that we've been talking about today, and we're able to come together as a human race in order to achieve that outcome, and then I'm optimistic.
Thank you very much. Well, on that positive but cautionary note, I'd like to bring this roundtable to a close.